program of action recognizes that healthy families are created by choice, not by chance.
That journey that began 25 years ago is far from over. It's now time to finish that unfinished business.
The Sustainable Development Goals cannot and will not be achieved until women, girls, and young people are able to control their bodies and their lives, free from fear and from violence.
Moving forward, we will not retreat. We will never give up. We are in a race to the finish line, and we shall prevail. Thank you. Nashukuru sana.
Good morning, good
Buenos
afternoon,
días, buenas tardes.
good evening, and welcome to today's global conversation
A esta
hosted
discusión
by
global
UNFPA, which is also being translated into French and Spanish. My name is Melissa Upreti, and I am Vice Chair of the United Nations Working Group of the Human Rights Council on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, and Senior Director of Program and Global Advocacy at the Center for Women's Global Leadership. I'll be moderating today's conversation, which is the 7th in a series of global conversations on how to accelerate the promise of the ICPD for women and girls. It's a crucial question, especially in the context of an unprecedented, once-in-a-lifetime global pandemic that none of us had foreseen. It's also a challenge, a necessity, and a call to action, and one that I believe that we can realize even in a broader context of pushbacks, because I'm an optimist. You see, when I immigrated to the United States from Nepal 21 years ago, I left behind a country with one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world, a criminal ban on abortion that contributed to many deaths and which led women to be sent to prison. Many women struggled privately with uterine prolapse, which wasn't even recognized as a public health and human rights concern. Fast forward to 2020, and Nepal has a new constitution that recognizes reproductive rights as fundamental rights. We have Supreme Court decisions that reaffirm the rights to contraceptive information and services and the right to safe abortion. We also have a new comprehensive law that recognizes the right to safe motherhood. As an insider, one thing that I can say was crucial to our success was that we looked around to see what was happening elsewhere, to draw inspiration for our own work. I remember being inspired by the Reproductive Justice Framework and the ICPD Program of Action. These frameworks resonated really strongly with me and the activists I worked with. They resonated with me as a human rights lawyer and as a woman from the Global South because of its holistic frame and its reflection of the interdependence and indivisibility of rights through many different facets of women's reproductive lives. This is why I'm excited to be here today, to hear about how the Reproductive Justice Framework can be used to tackle some of the greatest challenges of our times. And these challenges go beyond restrictions on access to essential reproductive healthcare services and extend to the denial of reproductive autonomy. Plus, as noted by my mandate, the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women, many times, they also reflect the instrumentalization of women's bodies through different forms of oppression, including, among others, racism, economic inequality, and gender-based violence. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to today's panelists. We have with us Dr. Natalia Kanem, UN Undersecretary General and Executive Director of UNFPA. Ms. Diana Quieta, UNFPA Deputy Executive Director on Program. Loretta J. Ross, Visiting Associate Professor at the Program for the Study of Women and Gender at Smith College. Alejandra Cardenas, Director of Global Legal Strategies at the Center for Reproductive Rights. Jordanos Wolde, Project Manager at Talent Youth Association. Dazen Dixon Giallo, Founder and President of Sister Love. Lynn Paltrow, Founder and Executive Director of National Advocates for Pregnant Women. And Annika Knudsen, Chief of the Sexual and Reproductive Health Branch at UNFPA. And we will have a performance by Monica Ray Simpson, Executive Director of Sister Song as well. So welcome to all of you. Before moving on to opening remarks, I would like to request our audience, please feel free to tweet this event and use the hashtag What's Next for Women. So now I'd like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Natalia Kanem, UN Undersecretary General and Executive Director of UNFPA, to make the opening statement.
Well, thank you so much, Melissa, and welcome everyone. Bienvenue, bienvenidos, bienvenidas. I would like to especially send a warm UNFPA appreciation to our superb speakers for today's dialogue on ICPD through the lens of reproductive justice. 26 years ago, just before the landmark International Conference on Population and Development was to take place in Cairo, 12 forward-thinking Black women came together in Chicago, Illinois, in the United States. The reproductive justice movement they conceptualized and founded brings together reproductive health, social justice, and human rights. And how fortunate we are that some of these remarkable women join us today. There in Cairo, the term reproductive rights emerged. And since then, sisters everywhere learned to make the terms reproductive rights and reproductive justice real. With the leadership and the vision of Black and Indigenous and Asian and Latinx and white women, and so many allies all around the world, the outcry for reproductive justice has resounded, reflecting the demands of women and girls everywhere for their full dignity. Last year, the Nairobi Summit drew strength from the reproductive justice movement. The world voluntarily pledged to accelerate action on the unfinished business from ICPD. And we had over 1,250 commitments. This is testament to our intention to realize the vision of Cairo once and for all. But now the COVID pandemic and the demand for an end to racism are holding a magnifying glass to deep-seated structural discrimination, inequality, and social, political, and economic injustice. And that's true in all our societies. It was Dr. Peggy Antrobus of Dawn who asked, as she came out of the Beijing Women's Conference 25 years ago, where is the passion, the sense of outrage that can galvanize us into action? Surely the sources of that passion lie in women's own experiences. And Dr. Antrobus was talking about women's advocacy against violence and war. She said, that advocacy is often too polite and too muted. I am outraged by the rising tide of violent criminal acts against women, and especially the femicides, the murders of women, which in some cases, like that of Marielle Franco and so many others, require that justice be served. UNFPA and the United Nations are working with countries and communities to bring that justice into the equation. Let us all address that aspect of reproductive rights. Let us dismantle the power structures and marshal the resources we need for women and girls and all individuals to make their own healthy decisions about their bodies, their sexuality, reproduction, families, for themselves. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and I'm looking forward to learning from today's What's Next discussion. Gracias. Back to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Dr. Kanem, and thank you so much for that call to action.
Merci
and also
beaucoup de
a
nous
little bit of
pousser à
history.
l'action.
And you know, the words that you chose to really remind us that our passion comes from women's experiences, our own as well as the other women that we work with. So I'd now like to move on to Loretta Ross, who will give the keynote speech for today's conversation. Over to you, Loretta.
Thank you. I will need my camera on. I don't have control of it. Thank you. Thank you. Now I can see myself and see the rest of y'all. First of all, I'm deeply honored to be on this panel, and thank you, UNFPA, for giving us this voice. One of the things that I bring to this panel is that I was one of the 12 women who co-created the concept of reproductive justice, because we were living in a country, the United States, that is causing so much harm around the world, but also harm to Black, Indigenous, Native American, Latina, Asian American communities here in the United States. And we felt that we needed a way to bring human rights home, because our country acts like a rogue country when it comes to protecting people's human rights. And we're the ones best positioned to hold our country accountable, because it's amazingly indifferent to criticisms from around the world, but it can be responsive when at this time that is dealing with the deconstruction of democracy. It's Black women that's got our fingers in the dike, basically. And so I'm not surprised that we were the ones that created reproductive justice. And reproductive justice, probably, I should say, I participated in that conversation on reproductive justice because I'm a survivor of teen pregnancy that was created through incest. And when I was 23 years old, I was sterilized. So I lost my reproductive capacity due to a doctor's decision that because I had one baby, I shouldn't have any more. And so I bring lived experience to this definition of reproductive justice. When we decided to splice together social justice and reproductive rights, to coin this term, we went on to define it in June of 1994 as the right to not have children, aligning ourselves with what was called the pro-choice movement at that time. And that means supporting the right to abortion, to birth control, to abstinence, if you think it works. But because we were Black women who had the lived experience of having our right to bear children so frequently denied by a white supremacist construct and state, we fight equally as hard for the right to have the children that we want to have and the conditions under which we want to have those children, which includes the development of a birth justice movement that's fighting for the right of midwives and doulas to participate in the respecting of our birthing plans. And then the third pillar of reproductive justice really is unaddressed by both the pro-life and the pro-choice movement, because that's the right to raise our children in safe and healthy environments. So this brings us into conversation with a lot of biological and non-biological issues, like whether or not there's safety in our communities, whether or not children have a right to an education, can escape violence, state violence, gun violence, immigration violence, uh, anti-queer violence, all of those violences that our people experience affect how we can raise our children safely and with dignity. And since the emergence of the reproductive justice framework in 1994, a fourth pillar has been added, and that's the right to personal dignity, gender identity, and bodily autonomy and sexual pleasure. So put all together, that's what reproductive justice means, and we base it on the human rights framework. And so when we went to Cairo in September of 1994, we found that our activists from the global South were using the human rights framework to make the same claims that we were demanding under reproductive justice, but finding no success under the limited US constitutional framework. And so reproductive justice became a way of bringing human rights home back to the United States and to move beyond the paralyzed abortion debate and really talk about what people need to have their human rights protected and respected as they make their reproductive decisions. And so it moved from the margins of Black feminist theory into mainstream conversations so that the larger reproductive rights organizations started using the reproductive justice framework. And surprisingly, it went transnational. And without any effort on our part, we found people in many other countries appreciating the expanded conversation that reproductive justice brings, because like we said at the ICPD in Cairo, that if you don't address systematic and intentional underdevelopment of our communities, you cannot address gender justice in our communities. And of course, that's what the Sustainable Development Goals also point out. And so reproductive justice has been an amazing framework for us for how broad it is, how elastic it is, and how inclusive it is, because no one is left out of it. Everyone has the same human rights, even as we need something different to protect and achieve them. So I'm proud to be one of the co-mothers of this framework. And again, I'm honored that y'all invited me to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Loretta. And it really is our privilege to have you here with us to talk about the reproductive justice firsthand and to share your vision, how it started out, the history, the evolution, its alignment with human rights, its links to gender justice, and what you also said about, how this went transnational and there were people in other places who started to appreciate it. I was one of them. And I have to say that it was really something that resonated with me and many others. And we have utilized it to really make significant advancements all over the world. So as we talk about the use of the reproductive justice framework to accelerate the promise for women and girls, I mean, it's definitely something that we need to carry forward with full confidence that it's going to yield incredible results. Thank you also for sharing your personal story. I think that really added something very powerful to your remarks. So with that, I'd now like to move to Monica Ray Simpson from Sister Song, who will give us a performance. Monica, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I guess it's still morning. It really is an honor to be here today. I'm so blessed to be able to be a part of this conversation as a reproductive justice leader and to see the impact of the ICPD, of this work of our foremothers that continues to drive me as a leader in the reproductive justice movement today. And also as a creative, as a cultural worker, as someone who believes in culture shift strategies to make an impact on our communities, I live by two quotes from two very powerful art activists. The first is Paul Robeson. He said that if the artist doesn't create, then the world suffers. The second is from Nina Simone. She gave us a charge to say that it is our duty to reflect the times. Today, I would like to offer a song to you all, an original song that is a charge for me, and I want to offer it as a charge to you. But in these times, that it is our duty to be the change that we want to be in the world. Thank you. I've been through some things, I've had to endure a lot. People tried to hold me down, take away the power I got, but I had to let them know they don't know who they messing with. I got this fire in me that burns so deep, nobody can hold me down. I know I've been changed. I know I've been changed. I know I've been changed. I got this fire in me that burns so deep, nobody can hold me down. We're in the midst of a change that's bigger than you and me. There's a charge we were born to keep. That was predestined before we were thought to be. We gotta keep on pushing. We gotta feel the fire deep within. We gotta make a change, reclaim our names. We got to make a change. Oh yes, oh yes. We've got to make a change. Yeah. We've got to make a change. Today we've got to do it. We've got to make a change. Starting with you and me, we've got to make a change. We've got to make a change. Yeah. Yeah. We have the power to heal the earth. We have the power to heal the earth. We have the power to heal the earth. We have the power. We have the power. We have the power to heal the earth. We have the power. Yeah. But we've got to start. We've got to start. Yeah. With you and me. Thank you.
Monica, that was amazing. I feel like standing up and clapping. I'm sure everyone is right now. That was so uplifting. And I think you just rekindled the fire in everyone. And it's exactly what we need right now in this context of COVID-19, where I'm sure many people, if you're anything like me, you're feeling a little anxious, overwhelmed, worried about the future. And, you know, because of COVID, since we cannot even meet in person and engage the way we used to, I think, you know, this kind of performance where we at least get to hear your voice that's so full of passion, it's just made my day, and I'm sure it's made everyone else's day. I just want to remind everyone that, you know, to live tweet this event, and this song is going to help us go viral, I'm sure. So thank you again, Monica, for that. So now we can move on to the discussion with our panelists. And I would like to start with Alejandra Cardenas from the Center for Reproductive Rights. So do we have you, Alejandra?
Yes, hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Great.
yes, I see you now. So it's great to see you again. Yeah, my question for you, Alejandra, is, well, basically, you know, you have devoted your career to defending sexual and reproductive health and rights through legal strategies. Can you tell us, in your experience, how has the human rights framework been instrumental to pursuing a reproductive justice agenda? And can you give us a few examples?
Well, thank you, Melissa, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel with all these powerful women, including you, that I look up to and admire so much. I would like to talk about the work that we do at the Center for Reproductive Rights. The center was founded in 1992, but inspired by ICPD, inspired by the reproductive justice movement. By the late 1990s, the center had global staff with a mission to make states accountable for their human rights obligations to sexual and reproductive health and rights. And also with the mission of pushing for the development of the human rights standards of what those obligations were that states should have to really respect, protect, and fulfill those rights. And for us, the human rights framework was a great toolbox in the fight for reproductive justice, because when you use that framework, you're not just saying that something is legal, you're saying that you have a right to have the state not interfere with the enjoyment of that right, but also that the state actually has to protect and fulfill that right. When it comes to the human right to education or the human right to health, the state also has the obligation to make services, goods, everything you need to really have material as that right be available, be accessible, not just geographically, but also economically. You have a right to have the state making sure that it is of good quality, that is acceptable. And we have, in all this time, we have used the human rights framework to really advance reproductive health and rights. But I wanted to share two examples of the work that we've done around maternal health, because I think they illustrate so well the intersecting oppressions that are impeding women from enjoying healthy and dignified pregnancies and deliveries. And they show how in our societies, some pregnancies are cherished and other ones are punished. One is the work that we did in Brazil, where we filed a case against the state of Brazil representing a poor Afro-Brazilian woman that by the end of her pregnancy was experiencing severe symptoms that clearly show she needed emergency obstetric care. Instead, when she went to the healthcare services, she was left unattended for 21 hours until she finally died. We filed this case before the committee that monitors compliance with the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And the committee sided with us, and it said that it was because of all these intersecting discriminations that were at play that this woman died. And it ordered the state to provide affordable, quality and non-discriminatory healthcare services and maternal care services. This was very important because when we started using the human rights framework, even allies within the human rights movement were skeptical if these were human rights issues and not just malpractice, for example. The other example I think is very powerful is some of the work that we've done in Kenya. In 2015, we challenged a practice that was very common in the Nairobi County, in which women who were indigent, who were unable to pay the fees for the obstetric care they were receiving, were detained in healthcare facilities. They were basically imprisoned. And we challenged that practice. And later on, we represented a woman that when she went in labor, she was forced to share a bed and was also left unattended, ended up giving birth unassisted on the floor, after which she was humiliated physically, verbally. She was even forced to carry her own placenta back into the delivery room. And the High Court sided with us, and it said, this is not just malpractice, this is a human rights violation. This woman was subjected to inhumane, degrading treatment, and there's an overall failure from this government to provide maternal care services in a way that is dignified, in a way that is of quality. And I think all of these examples just go on to show how we have used the human rights framework to really consolidate the notion that reproductive issues and choices are not just favors or luxuries. They are rights, and we are entitled to demand that the state respects, protects, and fulfills them.
Thank you very much, Alejandra. And I just want to pick up on something that you said earlier about intersectionality and how taking an intersectional approach is so important. I'm just wondering if there have been any particular challenges to doing that, or if it's been pretty smooth. Like how can we make sure that we are as inclusive as possible when we operationalize human rights strategies?
I think the first thing is to hear and really understand from the experiences of that those women are going through, because you probably just only see one dimension, but when you really investigate and sit down to really observe their experiences, what we see is how many forms of oppression are at play when these things happen. And if we are able to articulate that in a way that the human rights framework really addresses them structurally, particularly, is when we will be more successful. And the human rights framework has its own limits. It's not bulletproof, it's not perfect, but it's definitely proven to be a very strong toolbox in our fight for reproductive justice.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alejandra, for your remarks, for sharing your stories, and the incredible work that you do at the Center for Reproductive Rights.
Thank you.
So now I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Jordi. Are you with us?
Hi, I'm here. I'm trying to start my video.
Wonderful, no worries.
Let's start it. Hello.
Okay, all right. So while we wait for your video, wonderful. I think I'll just start with the question. So yeah, it's good to see you again as well. What I want to ask you is, well, you know, you've shared with me and you've shared with us previously that you have a very special connection to the ICPD, and you were also at the Nairobi Summit for the 25th anniversary celebration last year. So hearing from all the speakers on reproductive justice so far, hearing what you've heard, what connections and linkages do you see with your work in Ethiopia?
Well, it's quite an honor, first of all, to be on this discussion with amazing women who have led to the betterment of most of our lives, myself included to begin with. I was born in 1994. One would say an ICPD baby, to a mom who was married at the age of 14. She had 4 kids by the age of 20. And because of these powerful women activists, I sit before you privileged, a young woman with options. I get to choose my partner. I'm educated. I get the option to delay parenthood. And because of the ICPD program of action, I was a 6-year-old roaming the slums of Addis, where I was born and raised, advocating for equal treatment of people living with HIV. I started the movement wearing large, oversized white t-shirts with orange dots, to later find out that it was UNFPA. I sit before you again privileged, but carrying the not so privileged scars of my sisters, 13-year-old girls all across the rural slums of Ethiopia, where the party she'd been helping her mother prepare for months winds up being her own wedding party. A young girl who was not, in fact, getting married to someone that she knows, but someone she just met as a 13-year-old girl. These are the girls that I still fight for now, because we have not finished the business of the ICPD program of action. So I'm sure you will wind up meeting random people that will tell you, well, the reproductive justice movement is now moot. All of our plans have been achieved. Well, you can tell them of my sisters, your sisters, our sisters across the globe, who are still facing child marriages, female genital mutilations, gender-based violence all across the globe. On a broader perspective, to give you an update on what's been happening in Ethiopia after the ICPD in Cairo, our family law has been revised because of Ethiopian women activists who have taken on the ladder, who are now passing it on. And this family law has now allowed the minimum age of marriage to be 18. The abortion laws have been more liberalized to have 5 preconditions, which are underage girls, if there's incest, if it was because of rape, if it should affect the health of the mother, and if it should affect the health of the fetus. So these are some of the changes that have happened. However, we still are left with a lot of work to do. Marital rape is still legal in our country. child marriages are still on the rise. Unmet need for contraceptives is so high, especially among adolescents and young girls who have up to 90% of the unmet need inside the country. These are the reasons that we take on the torch that has been passed down by women like Loretta, that we're now working on and still hope to work on. Thank you so much for giving us that opportunity, and I hope that we can continue working together.
Thank you, Yordi. That was really, really nice. And when you refer to yourself as an ICPD baby, I feel like we are privileged to have you among us as part of this conversation, to be talking about, a framework that originated around the time that you were born. So I would just like to ask you a follow-up question, and that is, given the current context that we're in, so there's been a lot of progress over the years, for sure. But given the unprecedented situation we're in right now, as you look to the future, as an ICPD baby, who's still, young and has a lot of energy and probably not as cynical as some may be, what gives you hope? What keeps you going? Could you just talk about that in about a minute or two? Just tell us what gives you hope as you look into the future now.
Well, I'm very hopeful because one of the things that we've already mentioned is the fact that the generational gap is not an issue, but rather an opportunity. We have our mothers sharing their knowledge to us, and they're supporting us on the side. They give us that opportunity to be able to learn. And more often than not, it is always anticipated that the previous generation is the one that hinders you. But this movement is an exception. We have the previous generation that helps us, that lifts us up and gives us that opportunity. And I believe that this is an opportunity for us to be able to share that same strength, that same energy that you've all been able to share with us. And this is one of the reasons that I truly believe that this is not the end. We definitely can go together much higher, much further. And I truly believe that that's one of the reasons that I'm so hopeful.
Thank you, Yordi. Very well said. And I have to say, it's very reaffirming for people like me. And I feel a little more hopeful now after listening to what you just said. So thank you so much. I'd now like to move on to our next speaker, Dezan Dixon Giallo. There you are. Welcome.
Thanks, Melissa.
Nice to see you again. So Dezan, my question for you is, you were one of the founding members of Sister Song Reproductive Justice Collective, and you have worked extensively on human rights, sexual and reproductive justice, and the fight against HIV, not only in the United States, but also in South Africa. Can you share with us your thoughts on how reproductive justice can be applied in practice to advance the ICPD agenda? And why do you think the reproductive justice framework is so relevant today?
Absolutely. And I want to thank you, as well as my other comrades, my sisters who have just brought this conversation to, I heard a quote the other day, brought the conversation to the congregation. So I'm very, very excited to be here and a part of that, and for the question. What's interesting is that I came into this work around HIV from a sexual and reproductive health and rights history at a very young age. And what I realized immediately was that HIV and AIDS, as it was impacting predominantly Black women here in Atlanta, where I live, and other places, one, that was not just about HIV, and there were so many issues that were connected to their sexual and reproductive health that were not being addressed because they weren't being included. And then I couldn't find anybody else like us in the United States. I found much more common experience and parallel responses with my sisters in South Africa and other places. And I really found it in '94 at the ICPD in Cairo, where we were intentionally trying to find others that looked like us. what we found there, not knowing about the June conversation, was that HIV was not included. It was not in the platform. It was not in the conversation unless we were presenting the workshops or our other folks who were fighting HIV. And so it became a conundrum for us to figure out, well, how do we locate HIV and AIDS in the lives of women who are dealing with all the other challenges like violence and like hunger or like economic opportunity and equity. And then we realized that the platform of action, because it didn't include us, we had more work to do. And reproductive justice became that piece that we found ourselves able to locate HIV in it. It was even a few years later when there was a formal apology that was offered to women living with HIV. And I'm naming this because the sister who was speaking at that time was an openly living with AIDS woman named Promise Mthembu, who spoke at the ICPD Plus 10 in London. And she was offered that official apology to her and to all women living with AIDS at that time. We are now in this year, in 2020, as Sister Love in South Africa, partnered up yet again with Promise Mthembu, who is leading a campaign for women who are living with HIV who have been forcefully sterilized in South Africa. And so here's an intersection that we may have been fighting eugenics and sterilization in one way, but compounding that with the stigma and the discrimination that comes with an HIV diagnosis, having children with an HIV diagnosis, raising children, or even needing contraception and abortion care in a stigmatizing, discriminating way, is still an ongoing challenge of intersectional responses to people living intersectional lives. So there are very important ways that we take the issue or the whole framework of reproductive justice and apply it to just about any and every aspect of the work that we're doing around achieving full reproductive and sexual freedom for women and for girls. What I find most important about our ability to apply it and how it's relevant in these times is I would take, for example, not only the issue with our partnership with Her Rights Initiative, but our partnership with the Movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter, and dealing with the intersections of racial justice, gender justice, sexual justice, economic justice. There are places where, because of the inequity in the clean water or in the air or in the food that is grown, that nutrition required to maintain your medications if you're living with HIV, all of these issues are compounding because we have been working, even sometimes through the SDGs, in a siloed way. Working with reproductive justice from an intersectionality perspective means that we have an opportunity to deal with multi-issues in multi-movements, which means we have to build solidarity to undo the silos. And that's where we're living our work today in our conferences, in our meetings, but also in our service delivery. I love Monica's comment about in her song, we have the power to heal the earth. And we do that when we start healing ourselves first. And a part of that comes with getting in touch with our own stories and recognizing that our lived experiences are what give us power, and that power in itself is what shifts policy. And intersectionality is under attack because the opposition to women's autonomy, the opposition to women's sexual pleasure and expression, to our dignity, doesn't have a way to tell us from an intersectional way why none of those things should be afforded to us or should be protected for us and should be made real. And so I think it's important that we stick with intersectionality because it makes the other side uncomfortable. I think we should stick with reproductive justice in all of our activities today because it means that even inside our own movements, we have to be uncomfortable. And the last thing I would say that's most important is reproductive justice came from the lived experiences and frameworks of and the expressions of Black women's need to find a place in the movement. And I promise you that centering reproductive justice in Blackness for women and girls of all kinds of margins based on race and gender, race and ethnicity is where our work will find our best success. And that doesn't make us uncomfortable, but when we are comfortable, we're not trying to change anything. And I want to thank you for this moment.
Thank you so much, Daison. There was so much there. And I think one of the many points that you made that I think we all need to remember is just really the importance of emphasizing intersectionality and doing that in a way that we connect movements and we break silos and we build solidarity around issues. I think what you said about, you know, in your early days, not finding folks like yourself in the United States and sort of looking beyond and finding new connections and making those connections. I'm just wondering if you could just encapsulate in 1 or 2 minutes, what should the priority be for us looking forward in this context of a global crisis? What is one of the most important things we can do to accelerate the promise for women and girls, accelerate the promise of ICPD using the reproductive justice framework, but in relation to building solidarity? Where should we focus and how can we achieve that?
I love this question because I don't think we have all of the answers yet. I think that what we continue to do is ask the questions of what are the intersections in it's because it can be very individual. So what are the intersections that show up in the individual lives of women and girls based in the context of where they live, with whom they live, who they love, how they love, and how they are loved? We have to understand that so that our responses are responding to all of those pieces in those intersections that they live every day. Once we do that, and recognize that those stories are actually where the power to make change happens, is that we have to continue to create spaces like this where all of those stories come to life. And that when we go into those meetings and we're able to make decisions, those very lived experiences and those living stories come into those deliberations. And they show up in our policies. They show up in our funding decisions. They show up in how and who we select and elect get to lead those conversations. All of that becomes important, and that's how we get to undo the silos, but that's most importantly how we build the solidarity, because in the Ubuntu tradition, your story is my story. I am because you are. But if we don't give voice and we don't give ear to those stories, then we don't even know how much we are.
Beautiful words, Daison. Thank you. So powerfully said. A lot of takeaways there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I'd now like to move to our next speaker, Lynn Paltrow. Lynn is the Executive Director of National Advocates for Pregnant Women. Hi, Lynn. Good to see you again. My question for you is, well, you've been working to protect the rights of pregnant women here in the United States. When people think about reproductive rights and health in relation to reproductive justice, they often limit it to a narrow set of issues, if not one issue. What is the true range of concerns that we should be aware of and we should care about in this context?
It's a perfect question, and I'm so honored to be here, and just want to say that, you know, in moments of wondering, you know, how long we have to fight, the ICPD is absolutely one of the victories that reminds us that we're making progress, even if we haven't gotten to the final goal of justice for everyone. Very often there is a focus just on abortion. One of the beautiful things about even today is we're talking both about the ability to not be pregnant and also to have respectful births. But there are areas of connection that often get overlooked. For example, issues around mass criminalization, child welfare, which is really family separation, and punitive global drug policies. And how we get to that is that there are lots of individuals and organizations that and countries that attempt to interpret conventions that recognize the right to life as ones that apply to fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses, as if they are completely separate and independent of the pregnant person's body. The consequences of this are profound. There is no way to recognize a separate right to life for eggs, embryos, and fetuses and add them to the community of rights-bearing persons without subtracting pregnant women. And as we've seen in the United States, that argument has been used to justify not only outlawing abortion, but forced medical interventions on pregnant women, taking away their right to life. In Angela Carter's case, one of the first cases I worked on, in which a woman was critically ill, the argument was made her fetus needed to be delivered immediately, even though this cesarean, a forced cesarean, could kill her. And the judge ordered the cesarean based on the claim of the fetus's separate right to life. And in fact, both Angela and the baby died. That argument has been used to justify hundreds of arrests of women for being pregnant and using alcohol, using drugs, falling down a flight of stairs, attempting suicide, planning a home birth, having a miscarriage or pregnancy loss, or as happened to Marche Jones in Alabama. She was in an altercation while she was 5 months pregnant. A woman took out a gun and shot her. And Marche Jones was the person who was arrested for putting the right to life of the fetus inside of her in danger. And she lost the pregnancy as the result of having been shot. Fortunately, our organization and many others created such a national outcry. The prosecutor, as in many of these cases, did drop the charges. But the claims of fetal personhood very often distract from true personhood human rights movements like Black Lives Matter. And even when we're focusing on abortion, we tend to overlook the consequences of criminalizing abortion. It doesn't just criminalize a method, a procedure, it criminalizes the people who perform them and do them, as women in El Salvador and Mexico and the United States, both before and after our Supreme Court protected abortion, have found. If reproductive justice is the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe, sustainable communities, then we have to look at intersectional issues, including criminalization and global punitive drug policies. And what do I mean by that? Around the world, the number of women incarcerated for drug offenses has skyrocketed. And when they are arrested, you're separating mothers. Most of the women incarcerated in the United States and around the world are already mothers. Those arrests are disproportionately against certain communities in the US, Black, brown, and poor white mothers. They're separated from their children, or in some places, children are incarcerated with their mothers. In too many countries, including the US, that overwhelmingly, again, targets Black and brown families for deconstruction. Pregnancy and drug use leads to the loss of custody of one's children and family separation. In some countries, it also leads to coerced abortion or sterilization. Being pregnant and using drugs can lead to both of those things. And drug-related violence that results from worldwide punitive policies and state efforts to control it has destabilized civil society and thereby increased gender-based violence. As we stated in the UNGAS Women's Declaration, the Women's Declaration for UNGAS 2016, criminalization of the drug trade and efforts to stem that trade have literally fueled the fires of environmental degradation and demolished families' livelihoods as countries have burned coca plants and poppy fields from South America to South Asia. It is very tempting to focus on single issues, and we often fear connecting one really hard or unpopular issue with another. But the brilliance and the beauty of the reproductive justice framework is the recognition that human rights encompasses everyone and all rights, abortion rights, prisoners' rights, the rights of drug-using people, and it recognizes and inspires us to acknowledge the strength from uniting as human beings rather than as individuals or isolated causes.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I mean, obviously you've been working in this area for so many years, and I'm sure you have so many stories to tell. We do have a bit of time, so I would like to ask as a follow-up question, if you can, you said in your remarks that sometimes it can be difficult to connect different issues, and it's so easy, like the default is to fall into just that one silo that you have. or for anyone to do that, for a person to do that. So I'm just wondering if you could share with us an example of a personal example of when you may have come out of that silo and taken that step to make a connection where it actually yielded positive results. Is there an experience where it's actually made a difference that makes you feel that it is worthwhile?
Well, absolutely, and we can't achieve any of our goals, I think, without making these connections. I'll start out by saying I started my career defending the right to choose abortion, and then I started getting all the cases where the anti-abortion argument, particularly the claim that fetuses really have separate rights, and then got all the cases where those arguments were being used to hurt women who didn't want to end their pregnancies. I'll do another little aside. I recently gave a talk and was invited by somebody who knew me back when I was taking on abortion cases. And she said to me, "Lynn, what made you change from defending abortion to defending pregnant women?" And I was a little stunned because, of course, the people who need abortions are pregnant people, and they may need an abortion one day, but another day they're going to need support for birth, and every day they need to be recognized as full human rights-bearing persons. One of the kinds of cases we started getting in the late 80s and 90s were cases involving prosecutions of pregnant women, mostly Black women accused of using cocaine based on the crack baby myth. And a hospital in South Carolina was coordinating secret searches of pregnant women for evidence of drug use, turning that information over to the police, and having their Black patients taken out of the hospital, denied the right to health, denied the right to dignity, in chains and shackles to a jail, as if responding to either pregnancy or drug dependency problems actually promotes health. Nobody thinks it does. And many of the women came forward and were willing to challenge those secret searches and the policy of using the criminal law to respond to a health problem. The case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, where in a pretty extraordinary victory, the court recognized that you do not lose your protections from searches by the government, your right to care because you are pregnant or at a particular stage of your pregnancy. Mm-hmm. And so much of that is thanks to the 10 plaintiffs, the 10 women, including Crystal Ferguson, who were willing to challenge the extraordinary abuse they experienced.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that story, Lynn. And yeah, also reminding us that behind these cases, there are these individuals. There are always individuals, women who show extraordinary courage and bravery in coming forward, so that we can have these decisions that then benefit so many others. So thank you for that. I'd now like to move on to Annika Knudsen, who is the Chief of the Sexual and Reproductive Health Branch at UNFPA. Annika, welcome. So you are a midwife yourself, and your work with UNFPA focuses a lot on strengthening health systems and ensuring quality of care for women around the world. How do you see the links between reproductive justice and health system strengthening? Could you give us some examples and stories?
Thank you so much. And let me first say what an honor to be part of this sisterhood. I can't say how excited I am and blessed to be here today. And thank you for the question. I hope that I will bring part of the solution. As Dejan said, we don't have the whole solution to this, but we need to pull everything together. So the work we do on health system strengthening is really about building capacity so that individuals, women, men, girls, and boys can access their sexual and reproductive health services that they require and need and have the right to. It is not only about equity in access to services, it's really about lack of qualities of care is one of the strongest determinants for maternal mortality. We know that. So we focus also on quality of care and accountability. But I, as a midwife, then would like to take the example of childbirth, even though we've heard here the importance of going broad. But let me come back to the broad. I think the lack of quality that women experience many times relate to the lack of evidence-based care and best practice, but also the lack of respectful care, as we've heard. And as Alejandra was talking about, there is a growing human rights attention to the treatment of women by health providers during labor and delivery, and the mistreatment of women during childbirth has come to be termed obstetric violence. And it sounds horrible, and it is, and we've heard about it already today. But let me elaborate a little bit more on obstetric violence as part of the reproductive justice agenda, and use that as an entry point to speak about some of the complexities for this very stark expression of reproductive injustice that is many times justified as evidence-based, pushed for in the name of science, performed by professional medical authorities as part of a health system setting. And that is why it makes it really hard for women and for providers such as midwives to oppose or change it. So women, and we've heard about intersectionalities and the importance of intersectionalities, but women experience and encounter health systems where the power dynamics in the provider-patient power relationship, concerns for profit and cost efficiency actually leads to mistreatment and violence. So adding to that complexity is also that on the one hand, what women experience during childbirth in the facility may be an intervention that should be used, but should only be used in certain situations to save the life of the mother, the woman, or the baby. And these are like inductions of labor, C-sections, episiotomies, and use of uterotonics. But when it's performed either against evidence or best practice, or the woman's informed will, then it violates her human rights and is part of obstetric violence and reproductive injustice. When her voice is less heard because of race, gender, education, etc., it is really an expression of reproductive injustice. There are countries where C-section rates are 80% just because we want to accommodate the schedule of the doctor or to generate more income for the provider. And of course, there is a widespread mistreatment, verbally, physically, in the labor situation. And I would really like to take a minute to read an example from my research in an East African country, which is an observation from a hospital in a big city. And it just gives a very stark view of what this is about. It is 10 p.m. The light is harsh and cold. There are 3 empty delivery beds. They all lack knee or feet support. A girl in her late teens enters. She's expecting her first child. She looks bewildered and scared. She's in severe pain. The midwife is very busy with another woman, yells at her to lie on the side. And when the midwife finally has time for her, she decides to deliver the baby by vacuum extraction, and a huge machine is placed by her side. She cries that she doesn't want an operation. A doctor enters, stands between her legs, inserts the vacuum cup vaginally without any warning. The girl screams and tries to push herself away from the pain. She's now hysterical. The midwife scolds her for misbehaving. The doctor shouts at her. He slaps her thigh to make her lie down. The midwife asks what ethnic group the girls belong to, and when she says she's Gurage, she says that, oh, that's why you misbehave and talk back. I know you people. Everyone laughs. The doctor makes the episiotomy, again without warning. She wriggles and cries, and the baby is extracted and taken away. So I'm almost in tears when I read this because it's such a horrible situation. But what is then the solution to this? And I think the health system, like other societal systems, are influenced by, as we've heard here today, patriarchal structures and male dominance. It's not that we don't have female obstetricians. We have midwives, but they are part of the same system. And they experience the same kind of hierarchy and discrimination. So we, in our work, we want to ensure that women have, and their providers can provide the quality care that women want. We need to listen to women, and we need to listen to their providers, to the midwives. Someone stated once that respect is a choice, and it is, but only if you have the space and opportunity to make that choice. 70% of the health workforce globally are women, but only 25% of leadership positions in health are held by women. So that gives to show a bit of the imbalance that is the undermining piece here. In many low-income settings in the world, midwives work alone, around the clock with very little pay, with no electricity or running water, it is very difficult in that situation to deliver high quality, respectful care. What I want to say is that we should not blame and shame. We need to look at the underlying systemic things that are wrong. So our focus on ending preventable maternal deaths and enforcing the reproductive justice lens, as it has been said earlier, requires us to bring a broader lens that addresses all sorts of social and economic inequalities. Health system strengthening, and that's my final word, and gender equality and the empowerment of women must go hand in hand.
Thank you so much, Annika, for delving into those issues and bringing them all to light and really talking about how, the systems and the fact that there are so many structural problems and structural flaws that we also have to address. It's not that women themselves are somehow weak, but women are made weak. They're weakened by the structural problems and discrimination that exist. I'm just wondering, as a quick follow-up question, if you can reflect for a minute on the incredible spike in obstetric violence that we have been seeing in the context of COVID. There are lots of stories coming to light. There are many stories that have not yet been heard, but it's pretty clear that in this context of the increase in gender-based violence more generally, that there's also been a spike in obstetric violence. What can we do next to make sure that this issue doesn't get lost, and that, how can we elevate it to a point where there's some definitive action, because it is such an egregious violation of women's rights?
Yeah. I think we need to bring it to, as was said before, to different fora. This is one type of fora. And sometimes maybe we speak to the like-minded. So we need to bring it to discussions in the health system. We need to bring it in discussions on healthcare provider educations. We need to keep that alive, because what we see happening is that the discrimination and disempowerment of women, when women do not have access to the platforms where they can come together and maybe gather strength from one another, or from providers that actually have been trained in a way that will empower them, but are more left alone to themselves and to their maybe choices by family or male partners, which are not that considerate about where they go or how they are treated. So I think that in the name of COVID, a lot has been happening. And I think there is a lot that has happened that had not need to happen. And I think because we want to have we think we want to have systems that are effective. And effective is not doing things in short time, especially not when it comes to women's health and childbirth. You need to actually know that the evidence shows that if you give the normal birth process its due time, you will have much less complications. You will have much less need for cesarean sections, etc. Mm-hmm. So we need to go back to that real evidence and not just trust what the medical system provides.
Thank you so much, Annika, for those wise words. So now I think with that, we've kind of we're ending the conversation segment, but since we had such a robust conversation, I do want to ask Dr. Kanem if you have any reflections that you would like to share before we start wrapping up.
Well, absolutely. And it's been a very rich array of presentations, but also analysis. And that's what we're after, because as we're thinking of reproductive rights, if the rights holder herself, and you already referenced a 13-year-old who's going to be married off, if the rights holder herself does not know that she has rights, or if she approaches the obstetric room as someone who is obliged to be grateful to be there rather than somebody who is claiming her rights. This is when the reproductive justice rubric is most needed. I've also been very interested, and if Loretta or Lynn or Jason would like to comment on this very important question of how is it that the system can be shifted? COVID, and I think the Black Lives Matter moment, the fact that Indigenous people are very much at higher risk from what should be a virus that's affecting everybody, generically, but that's not the way it plays out because of the systemic issues. So much as Annika has rightfully said, we're not really here to blame and shame, which is not productive typically. We do have to be able to raise the demand. So I believe that that's part of accelerating the promise of ICPD 25. And it's also part of the broader movement of the Sustainable Development Goals. All of these things are connected, including the environment and climate issues, which the original reproductive justice women wrote in there, long before many of us could see around the corner. Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you. Dezan, I see you on the screen, so I can give you the floor for a minute if you'd like to share some thoughts.
Sure, and I'm hoping that it doesn't, thank you, Natalia, for that question, because I think it's so important for us to think forward or almost bring our president to the future. And one of the things, and I'm taking this from Yurdi's comments even at the beginning of our conversation, is that I am not as convinced that we are going to be able to change the minds and the hearts of those who are in power to do the right thing for us. And so we have to change those who are in power, who have their hearts and minds in the right place for us. I heard a comment from a young woman just last week when we were talking about the urgency around voting and the urgency around political participation of women and girls. And she said, today we vote, but tomorrow we run. And I think what's important is that we, as Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley from Massachusetts tells us on a consistent basis, that the people who are closest to the pain must be the people closest to the power. And that's what has to change in order for us to make these monumental shifts that we do. And we see that happen in so many different ways at local communities and even in the global systems that we have, in the representation, for example, of even the women leaders who are in the UN system. And we have to do the same in our civic, our municipalities, our states, our provinces, as well as our national governments.
Thank you, Dezan. So I would like to give Loretta the opportunity to say a few words before we wrap this up, since you are obviously, a lot of it started with you. And after hearing the comments and reflections today and examples of how the framework has already been put to such great use, do you have any further thoughts or reactions to anything anyone said? I can give you 2 minutes.
Well, the beauty of the reproductive justice framework is how it was created through collective action by Black women. It wasn't any one of us that did it, but it was pulling all of our power together, pulling all of our intellects together. And that's what it's going to take to shift this dangerous direction that the world is on. I think it's going to take the power of women to really redirect us from this precipice of disaster for the earth, for democracy, and for our individual lives and our individual countries. And so I want to just say that we can work better together when we learn to call each other in, and like Dezan referenced, Ubuntu, understand that our destinies are hooked to everybody else's destinies, that we are interdependent, because COVID has shown us that the amount of money you have, the number of gates you have around your house, the number of servants you have cannot protect you from a virus. You can't shoot a virus. You can't ignore a virus. And so we're at this moment where we're recognizing our mutual interdependence as inhabitants of this fragile earth. And it's going to take all of our power, but particularly women's power and women's viewpoints, because we tend to see the connections of all humanity and the connections between ourselves and Mother Earth in a different way than that individualistic, atomistic male view that has been foisted upon us. And so I'm really excited about the opportunities, because every crisis has an opportunity. And we have opportunities available to us to build the kind of world we'd like to see, like Monica's song reminded us. And so I'm really excited, even though I'm alarmed by this tip towards fascism that the world is seeming to flirt with, but I don't think they're going to succeed. I think they're demographically doomed because of women. And so I'm really excited. And one thing we used to say in the early feminist movement, that when you mess with women, you're in trouble because we multiply. So that would be my final word.
Very well said. I mean, after all, women are what, half the world's population? We're there. Like we have that level of strength. We may not have the level of institutional power that we need to transform things, but I think we're getting there. And especially with, with this kind of spirit and wisdom and knowledge and intergenerational sharing and cooperation, I think we're going to get there sooner than we think. So we do have a few minutes. So what I would like to do is also just give Alejandra, Jordi, Lynn, and Annika a minute each, just for any final thoughts that you may have after having listened to what everyone had to say.
Thank
so,
you.
Alejandra.
Thank you, Melissa. Yeah, I think I've been once again inspired by all of you. And I think as somebody from the global South and somebody who grew up struggling in a family that was fighting for human rights, I think that I'm very proud of what the social justice movement and the human rights movement has achieved. But I think it's time to really create real links of solidarity and connect the dots on all these different forms of oppression and stop fighting in silos. We really need to start articulating more of our fights if we want to survive and take us to the next level.
Thank you, Alejandra. Lynn?
Thank you. Just jumping off of there, we do, even in the worlds we're in, we do tend to still see certain groups of people. And the ones I see all the time are separated out are women accused of being pregnant and using drugs. And, people are sitting in jail for having stillbirths in the United States based on the claim that some drug caused it when it doesn't cause stillbirths. And that we have to be willing to examine the prejudices and stigmas that come with, that are encouraged by things like the ongoing punitive drug war policies. But one of the things I want to share, and I thank all the speakers for inspiring me, is one of the things I sometimes do with audiences is I say, please raise your hand if you know somebody who's been pregnant. And there's a pause. And the men particularly are like, what are they asking me? What is she asking me? And the point is, none of us would be here without somebody who went through pregnancy and gave birth. And it is the strength of that and the shift we need to make so that reproductive health care, maternal health care is just seen as human health care because the survival of the species depends on it.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. We shouldn't be in a position where we have to fight for it even, right? It should be there for everyone. So thank you. So Jordi, I'd like to go to you.
I've already been able to thank some of you all here actually for the amazing work, and I would also like to thank others that have been pushing for this same agenda. But I would also want to take the opportunity to call upon other adolescent girls and young women across the globe to join our efforts together in amplifying our voices, to work together for the cause that has already come so far, but can go even further. And this is something that I'm sure all of us share. And I hope that you all join me and everyone on this panel in fighting for reproductive justice and women's rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Annika?
Thank you. Yes, one reflection I want to make is that we all have different roles in getting this right. We can all say different things. We can do different things as different organizations, as different individuals, and let us do that. Let us not make this event something that we thought was really good and we forget about it. Let us not lose track of Black Lives Matter, not for the US, but also not for the rest of the world, because Black Lives matter globally. And I think Black lives, women's lives really matter. And there is a tendency that the attention is spurred and then we go back. We really need to keep going with that, and we need to go to ourselves first before we do anything else. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika. Wonderful. So with that, I think our conversation is now really coming to an end. I would like to request Ms. Diane Kieta, UNFPA Deputy Executive Director on Program, to make the closing remarks.
Thank you, dear moderator. Thank you, Melissa. Dear Natalia, our dearest Executive Director, amazing panelist. What a fantastic conversation. What a fantastic conversation. What a moment as a woman, as a mother, as a professional. Today, we heard from the mothers of reproductive justice movement, together with the generation of the daughters that are continuing the battle in different corners of the world. We have so much to learn from the history, from the strength and resilience of the reproductive justice movement. This movement was started by women who felt their issue weren't reflected enough within feminist organizations. In the last 25 years, they not only succeeded in giving visibility and strength to their cause, but their model also inspired activists in different regions of the world. We hear you. We hear you very, very well. As UNFPA, we are committed to giving greater visibility and voice to reproductive justice issues in our work. But we know there is so much more work to be done. We are not there yet to fully ensure that the needs of the most marginalized women, families, and community are put at the center. But we are working on that. And with the kind of leader we have today, Dr. Kanem, I can assure you're working on that with all our partners that are key to that process. The freedom of choices for women and adolescents, the ownership of their body, their sexuality, and reproduction continue to be the lived reality in all corners of the world. We cannot tackle all these issues unless we are able to connect the dots and have a comprehensive response. So that's why this conversation is so important. To ensure sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice, we need to fight for the freedom of choices. We need to fight for equality. We need to be vocal about how reproductive rights are linked to social, political, and economic inequalities that affect women's sexual and reproductive decision-making. Last year in Nairobi, we worked to create a platform for meaningful dialogue among activists of different generations across sectors. This dialogue catalyzed new ways to collaborate and take action. It has clearly articulated the ICPD agenda's relevance today. We are determined more than ever to continue this journey, becoming stronger with every step. Once again, I thank you so very much on behalf of UNFPA, on behalf of my boss, Dr. Kanem, for sharing your experience, passion, and energy. Together, we will continue to fight and work towards advancing sexual and reproductive health and rights globally. I thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kieta, for those closing remarks. And now, as moderator, I guess I would like to start wrapping up and closing the session by thanking all of the participants today, all of the speakers, for your incredible contributions, insights, your stories, and inspiring words and wisdom. I think there are a lot of takeaways from today's conversation that are going to help us in the days to come. I'd also like to thank the audience. We can't see you, but I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. And please do share the link, do disseminate it among friends and allies so that others can also enjoy what has been heard today and take it all in. I would also like to say thank you to UNFPA for hosting this conversation, the entire series, of course, but especially this one, I think was quite incredible. The way you brought everyone together, the people you brought together. Thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to come together in this virtual space. I do want to say special thanks to Iram and Alvaro, who worked very closely with everyone and the other members of the team, including the interpreters. And everyone else behind the scenes who contributed to this event. Do join us for the next episode, the next session of the What's Next series that will focus on women's agency in ending extreme poverty, empowering women in small island states. I'm sure that's going to be another very exciting and important conversation. We do have a few minutes left, fortunately. So now I'm going to turn the floor over to Monica. Back to Monica for a closing affirmation. And Monica, if you would like to preface that with a few words, closing words, please feel free to do so. But over to you, and then we'll end today's conversation.
I think I did it right. Awesome. This was such an incredible conversation. Thank you all so much for having me be a part of this and to add a cultural intervention into this conversation today. As we, have an opportunity to close with each other in this intentional way, I just want to encourage everyone, if you can, wherever you're sitting, to just take a moment to bring your attention to your breath in whatever way that feels good for you. Maybe that means that you close your eyes. Maybe that means that you just find a point that you focus on in your home, in your office. And I ask that we take some collective breaths with each other, deep breaths into our being. And with each breath, I want to ask that you think about what you are bringing in to yourself and what you are releasing from yourself. At Sister Song, we start all of our conversations, our political education series, and all the things that we do with a very simple phrase that we all have a story to tell. And our stories are our source of power. And in this moment, those of us who are committed to reproductive justice, to liberation in our lifetime, it is going to take us being deeply connected to that which is within us and what we are giving out to the world. There's another quote that I live by as a leader, and it's from Assata Shakur. She says, "It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love and protect each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains." The beautiful thing is our collective action, our collective work will win. Our silos will not save us. It is our ability to stay connected that will take us to victory. And after hearing all these amazing speakers today, many of which whose shoulders I stand on as a reproductive justice leader now, hearing that wisdom, being a part of this conversation allows me to know that with that, we are all here together and we will win. So I'm grateful again to be able to be a part of this conversation, to learn, to connect, to be with each one of you. And so as we leave this conversation, but never each other in spirit, I ask that you at any time that this gets hard to remember that breath, to remember your story and know that your power lies there. And move forward in that power. Peace and blessings. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.